And it's showtime! Welcome to the Hyomoto and Julien Programming Podcast, episode number 3. I'm Hyomoto.
I'm Julian, and I'm told I'm not enthusiastic enough, so take this with the most enthusiasm I can muster.
He is putting his all into this performance. So we've talked about a couple things in the past. We'll talk about a couple things in the future. Today's topic will be timing and the experience thereof. So to just cover a really basic idea of timing at the beginning, GameMaker essentially runs in frames, and the simplest version of that is going to be the step and draw events because they do run every single frame in order. And so if you wanted something to happen sorry, I should mention that we're going to talk about alarms, but just not yet. And so if you wanted something to happen over time, essentially you could measure how many frames had passed by simply counting them. And since room speed is the number of frames in a second, you can multiply the room speed by those frames in order to get the final time that you wanted. So I want to look at something that's kind of like a cutscene generator, so to speak, and kind of start off with a nice simple GML concept. So we start out with our calculation, as spoke of before, which is going to be room speed multiplied by some number, and that'll equal our seconds. And if we know this, then we can say counter is plus equal to 1, and now we're counting. No big surprise there, but we're counting. And so how can we turn this into events that happen over time? Well, we can reach into our tool bag, our abused switch statement, and we could do something like this. We could say, hey, on this counter, when it reaches, let's say, 60, to do something. And then, the switch statement runs. And then next time we say, hey, at case 600, do something else. And by doing this, we're essentially building a list of stuff that we want to happen at certain points in time. And hopefully either you've seen something like this in the past, or maybe you've done something like this in the past, or maybe it just makes sense because you go, oh wow, I could just keep adding more case statements for every time I wanted something to happen. Now, the more astute among you may notice this, and I'd like to immediately move into why this is bad. The big one that we'll notice here is, let's say I decide, 60 was too short. 1 second. That was too short. I'm going to make this a 90 now. So it's going to happen after 1.5 seconds. I'm like, that's good. But now we've created a problem. The relation between these two numbers has changed. It used to be 540. All of a sudden, it's 510. So now I have to go in there and update this as well. Okay, it's not 600 now, it's 630. And you can imagine if you have really interesting timings like 15 and 49 and, adding these all up and adjusting it every time you want to make a change. Ooh, does that sound painful? Julian, does that sound painful to you?
Oh, I wish it didn't.
It's very painful. So let's look at a way that we can kind of improve this situation. And maybe this will kind of be like the theme that you can take away from this is look, this system, it has its flaws. And Julian's going to talk a little bit about that and what he thinks is better. But right now, let's just look at how we can improve some system like this. And namely, what was the problem? The problem was we don't want to do all this math and adding. We want to leverage the power of the computer to be able to do it for us. So let's look at a different way of doing this. Instead of counting up, let's count down. And then we want to say if our timer is equal to 0, now do my switch statement. I'm still going to have some sort of a variable that can keep track of this, but now I can just say, hey, when event is 0, set my timer to 600, and then my event to, let's say, 2. Now, obviously, I might do some other code in here because this would be really boring if all it did was count and never did anything of use. But you can see now we've taken the timing and we've separated it from the event that should happen. In this case, once the first event runs, it's going to set timer to 600. 600 divided by room speed, assuming 60 frames per second, is 10 seconds. So 10 seconds later, event number 2 is going to run. Why? Because we sent event number 2 right here. And once timer is equal to 0, we're going to switch case on that event. So here's a nice, simple little system that we can use to kind of create timing. Now, is it the best system? No. One of its big flaws, in my eyes, is that what is event 0? What's event 1? What's event 2, 5, 10? How many events are there? We really don't know. But as a quick and dirty way of getting events up and running in a useful fashion, it's not a bad place to start.
Yeah, most certainly. I've actually never seen that way of doing it before. It's most certainly one of the more elegant ways to do it if you're going to approach it in a simple fashion. But it has multiple flaws. For example, let's say your room speed halves because you have a lot of objects in scene that do a lot of stuff, and now you have 30 frames instead of 60 frames. And other things happen 20 seconds later, and then we get into the realm of either delta timing or we need to write a proper cutscene generator. And another issue is, and this will be brought up every time you try to solve something with the switch case statement because it's a stupid way of doing things, and generally doing it this way is referred to as hard coding something. Basically, the issue is if you write code like that, you'll end up with such a big switch case statement.
Oh, yeah.
It's just going to be unmanageable, and you will probably end up with code that doesn't belong in there because you can't, like, you'll have a harder time encapsulating events if they all happen in that big switch case statement. And well, point of the matter is you want something to happen after it has finished happening. If that sounds oddly familiar to state machines, that's because it's practically the same concept.
I believe that, in fact, this was exactly what you described during our state machines. Keep going.
Yeah, the thing is, if you want an event to happen, it's going to start somewhere, it's going to happen, and it's going to end somewhere. And matter to the fact is, if you abuse a state machine in that manner, and Unity does that quite well, I think, and I did abuse it that way, is you can create cutscenes if you abuse that state machine like that. So you can create your state, and that is whatever event walking. And then whenever you walk 6 frames forwards, and then you walk for 6 seconds, and or 60 game ticks, and then you'll have to account for frame loss and whatever. And that is one of more elegant solutions, albeit still quite primitive. And that way you leverage another system that is, well, kind of meant for it. You leverage another system you already wrote, which is really nice. And it's more about how you can use that system in a more flexible way, which is really nice because then you don't have to write something twice and you can abuse something you've wrote already for something it might have not originally been meant to, but it is perfectly capable of doing it that way.
I did not cue this up for this particular talk, but it reminds me of what I was doing for the flagpole animation in Super Mario Brothers. It's very, very abusing both the state machine and the animation machine, because what it would do is it would just put Mario into a state where he would walk towards the flagpole, and while he's walking towards the flagpole, it would literally just check, hey, has he reached the flagpole yet? Has he reached the flagpole yet? Sorry, when he's sliding down the flagpole, it would say, has he reached the bottom of the flagpole yet? Has he reached? And when he does, then it goes, okay, go to the next state. And what's funny is you might not think of that as being a form of timing, but it is a form of timing. It's just a form of like stage directions. When it came to something like the fireworks, the fireworks would just be like, hey, when the animation ends, if there's still fireworks left to play another firework. It's a total abuse of the system, but at the same time, what is timing if not saying, I want something to happen after this is finished? And really, that's kind of what we're stacking up. To go back to what I started with there at the beginning, what you might also think of, because they are very popular in Game Maker Studio, is the alarms. And the alarms are an interesting piece of Game Maker Studio because they work fine. This is not going to be me railing against alarms and telling you why they are bad. 10 reasons why alarms can go eat themselves. Instead, it's the big flaw with alarms, believe it or not, is that we don't know when they happen. And that might sound funny, but a lot of times your video games, especially when we're talking about cutscenes and timing, is that one thing happens after another thing. And a lot of times you might want to rely on the fact that code happens in order to make something happen properly. And not knowing when that alarm is actually going to fire, suddenly it creates a little bit of a problem. You can still get around it, you can still work with it, and to push in a little soapbox here, honestly, writing your code in a way that doesn't rely on timing is superior in a lot of cases. But the other little trick of the alarms is that they are best suited for very specific tasks that you want to run frequently. Like, because let's say you have like a knockback effect, and you might say, okay, set this alarm, and then when that alarm goes off, it sets that knockback back to false or something like that. Here's a great example of not knowing when it ends being kind of a problem, because you might want to move back 11, but you move back 10. Or maybe you wanted to move back 10, but you move back 11 because you just don't know where it is. And something we haven't talked about yet, but I love to talk about in my spare time, is this is where bugs come from. The It's when something unexpected happens, something you didn't plan for, because you only expect the player to move so far back during a knockback. But if for some reason the program's like, hey, I'm going to go for further than you thought, you might not account for that. And there's really no reason that you should, because it should work the way you expect. But with alarms, we don't know when they end. And so, like, if you were doing like crop growing logic and you wanted to say, hey, every 600 frames, update the crop in the field or something like that. That would probably be a good idea. You don't need to run that every frame. And it doesn't really matter if it runs now or after, one frame. It just matters that it runs. And so that can be a really cool way to do something like that. What do you got for me, Julian?
And the other thing, alarms are great for, which I am guilty of, and it's such an easy solution. Speaking about timing, sometimes not wanting to rely on timing, but rather writing good code. When I started to with GameMaker, I'd have objects I'd create, and then I'd notice, well, I can't initialize that here and now because that will crash the program. But I can do it next frame, and so I set an alarm to 1 and had it run next frame, and that did work. But it creates this problem where you're like, okay, I have my alarm code here. I want to have this happen next frame, and then I have my code in there, and then you look at the object's create event, and you see, oh well, that's the alarm in there, and now I have to check the alarm, and then there's this code in there, and now I want to create another object that relies on this object, so I have to set another alarm, and that has to be a little farther, and you end up in a hot mess.
Yes, you keep pushing it further and further out. It's
Which is
actually, I hadn't prepared for that, and I love that you brought that up, because novice coders probably not going to run into this too much. They still tend to rely on the instance creation order, but I guarantee everyone will run into a situation where they have two objects and one relies on the other. And so a really elegant solution would be just to use the room start event. But now we're back into, if we have something that relies on that object, oh, we're back to square one, aren't we? We've gone nowhere. We've spun our wheels.
And well, again, a great way of doing that is what's practically mounting to a game state machine is where you have your object, you initialize it, and then that object sets whatever, like something like object sound manager uh, creation, and it sets it to finished. So, and then you have another object, which another event, let's say, that kind of it's called listening to that. That listens to that event, and whenever it finishes, it starts another event. And that way, you have timing related code that doesn't necessarily rely on frame timing, because frame
Sure.
timing can be quite tricky, especially in a game maker, since we have, if you check it out, there's FPS real, I think, FPS room speed. There's another one, I think,
Well, and the
and
uh, the
there's
images use their own
delta.
damn timing as well. If you're relying on built-in animations, uh,
So there's way too many kinds of timing options, and you tend to run in a lot of issues. especially if you're starting out, you might not really understand
Oh
because
yeah.
what's the difference between FPS real, room speed, FPS, and it gets quite messy, quite tricky, and you'll write a lot of code. So
Yes. Oh yes. The
to kind of
oh
circle
sorry, go ahead.
back, yeah, and to kind of circle back to what I was saying. So what you're really writing isn't code where you wait for something to finish because that would actually be called a coroutine, which is impossible in GameMaker. And because in GameMaker you have to rely on the fact that code is run in a linear fashion and that it happens every frame and that the frames are kind of fixed per se. And when you end up writing code that relies on something being finished instead of something happening at a specific point in time, and then you start writing better timing code because timing isn't about when the specific point in time is done. It's about when something is finished if you think about it. I hope
Yeah.
that makes a bit more sense than it does in my head.
The okay, so I will say that while coroutines specifically are not in GameMaker, you can get
Mm.
coroutine like behavior. It does it like everything in
Uh,
GameMaker. It requires a bit of effort. Like as a fun little story, methods didn't used to be in GameMaker, but I still wrote methods for GameMaker 2.2. And the really funny part was when GameMaker 2.3 came about, my methods clashed directly with GameMaker's methods, and I actually had to rewrite my code so it wouldn't, because obviously GameMaker wins. But something that's interesting about that is we say is yeah, you say, hey, we want this timing, we want something to happen when it's finished, and I guess when we really start to dig into it, you're going to end up in an event queue, I think, if you're really working at it. But I do want to talk about that initialization thing because this is kind of an event queue situation. Was I've been into MGUI recently. Everybody should be fully aware that I love that thing, but it has some bugs or inconsistencies in it. I'm not quite sure which ones they are, but sometimes things don't happen quite as you would expect. But like many timing related things, sometimes things don't happen in the order you want them to. Like if I want to initialize my menus at the top of the screen in a certain order, I have to know that code is going to run in a certain order that will yield that result. And so what I started doing was for MGUI was my debug module has an attach function. And during the room start event, you would call attach to the debug module or whatever module you wanted to attach to. And then basically it will sort it out on the first frame of the game. and it does so by creating an event queue because, as I mentioned, the create event, room event paradigm I think is amazing and everyone should be using it. The main reason for using room start is to allow you to place objects in the room and have them run code properly. If you shove everything into create event, you're kind of asking for pain. Sometimes you have to, but for anything that you want to be able to place into the room, there's a good chance that you should be using the room start event because you want to take for granted that the object could be in the room when the room starts. And yeah, but with MGUI, I can't do that because my menu consists of like the audio manager and the scene manager and da da da, and those rely on MGUI having been created in the create event, so they attach themselves. But oh no, I want to attach something to scene manager. Ugh, now scene manager has to exist first, but there's no way for me to know what I want to attach to it until I've written that code. So in this case, I write an event queue, and basically all it is it's literally just an array that's like it's like, hey, run this function. It's ever so slightly more complex than that, but not much. It's just saying run these functions. And so each one will then naturally attach itself to the proper segment so that it can run in the order that I want it to. The only thing is I have to push it off to the begin step of the very first frame of the game, which, as a small plug, that's a feature that Fast has in it, which is my library. But it's not mandatory or anything like that. It's just that having it available already is something you kind of wish the GameMaker had. Like, GameMaker, can I please just run an event once? No. But in Fast, you can be like, hey, run this event once, and it will totally do that. Which, speaking of timing, if you want to make your timing really easy. All right. Anyways, so yeah, it's I don't know if we want to talk about event queues. Do we want to talk about event queues? I feel like we've been dancing around them.
I suppose it's the natural thing, the natural order of things, kind of.
Well, actually, this is what I was going to bring up. So you had talked about we've all used these other timing methods before, and you're using the one that you have now. But how did you solve some of those earlier problems? Let's walk the code back to some intermediate stuff instead of the advanced stuff. How did you end up solving some of those problems back when you had them?
I created more problems. That's kind of how I solved them. I was a while ago, like 3, 4 years ago, I think I wrote a bullet hell game. And in a bullet hell game, you want your enemies to spawn and do things periodically. Well, my solution to that is I have a huge amount of alarms, and every single time specific one runs out, something happens, and some of them repeated, some of them didn't, and it all was so incredibly messy because not only did I have alarms, I also had, like, how you mentioned that switch case thing?
Yes.
If you want to make something happen periodically that way, you could also do modulo, which basically you modulo the counter by, let's say, 4, then every 4 frames, this
Yes.
event will happen.
Yes. It's a good point. It's a good point.
And yeah, and I had that too in the alarms, in the step event, and I I I didn't solve it. It was incredibly messy in that game. Then a year ago, I think by now, I created another bullet hell game for a game jam, and that time I used Unity. And Unity has this really nice feature called animations and animators, where you can,
Hmm.
when a specific thing in an animation happens, you can have it run a function in a script.
And just
Uh,
abuse the hell out of it.
I abused the hell out of it. It was a game
I'm
jam, so
wondering
the
if we
code is.
could use new sequences to do that. I bet we could. I bet you
I think
could.
you can,
I
yes.
bet it would be hellish and I would hate every moment of it, but I bet you could.
Mm. Mm.
I mean, it would still be an improvement.
I personally don't know. I think Matthew who knows a little more about that, but I think you can leverage sequence to that, absolutely.
Yeah, they have
Um,
the broadcast feature and just stuff like that. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, keep going, keep
the
going.
point being, it makes more sense when you think about timing, not to think about when something, again, not to think about when something should happen in time, but when something should happen like in a sequential fashion. Because really, what you're thinking of when you say like after 1 second this should happen, when you're thinking about, for example, an animation being played,
Sure.
you're thinking about when this frame in the animation finishes, this should happen.
Hmm.
And what I didn't end up doing in the Unity
Well,
game
and
was,
I will interrupt you here just what
yeah.
because I feel like it amplifies it well is that you don't because you say like 6, right? 6 frames, 6 seconds, but like that's not really what you necessarily want. It might be what you want, but a lot of times what you want is you're like, hey, when I have reached a certain point, like once the
Mhm.
characters reach this position, because maybe they started 4 pixels away, maybe started 6 pixels away, depending on exactly what you're working with. And so just saying 6 frames or even calculating how many frames, that would be so wasteful. Like really what you want to know is like, hey, has this condition been reached?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great point. It didn't matter in like the bullet hell game because that's kind of not like there was no cutscene. It's kind of not what bullet hell games are for. But what I did end up doing was when the enemy, like, it had this arm animation which like slapped the screen,
Sure.
and when it was at the center, it would play like would execute a function, and that would then create the bullets. And that's, well, it's not only a much more visual approach to things, like if you're thinking about
Hmm.
sequences and abusing them, it's also more like like I said, sensible approach because you don't want the game to reach a certain point in time because that could happen anytime. And if you're
Yes.
having issues with frame rate and everything, you might actually miss that event, for example. And as you said, that might introduce bugs because that's not what you're expecting. Because when you're thinking about time, you're expecting this very consequential linear thing, but in reality, when you're missing on a frame and skipping a frame, that's not linear. And the thing is, to circle back to like truity of states, it's kind of a truity of events in this sense because you are going to reach a certain point or go past it if you keep walking. But if you think after 1 second I should be at that point, that might not happen because the character might have like there might have been a frame dip, so it for 1 second only it walked a little less, so you don't reach that point that makes cutscenes go a little wonky.
Now, I will argue that this is less of an issue in Game Maker if you're using frame timing. If you're
Mm.
using delta timing, that's definitely an issue because you could be like, okay, X amount of time passed, and now I have to account for that. It's not necessarily. It's one of those interesting things where delta timing has its place and frame timing I think still has its place. There's a reason why people prefer one or the other. Frame timing is generally easier to work with because you just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Mm.
6, boom, we're done. Delta timing, it's all about like, hey, 6 seconds have passed, 5.4 seconds. Now, that's where it ends up being a little bit more flexible, except I will say this, and I don't know, somebody's probably come out of the woodwork to be mad at me for this one, but uh, the reason why it doesn't work as well in Game Maker Studio is because if you wanted to use delta timing, what you really kind of need to do is turn the room speed up to really high. Because if the room speed's at 60, there's really no reason to use delta timing because you're going to be missing so many frames anyways because it's it should take the same amount of time to reach each frame as it did the last one. So the only way to really get more time or more time accuracy would be to increase the speed. And it is funny because I've had this debate before about delta timing in Game Maker Studio, and I won't say whether I think it's better, like it's important or worse, but I will say that I don't always see the necessity of it because if you understand why delta timing exists in 3D games or even engines like Unity, then you'll understand why Game Maker Studio doesn't worry itself too much about it. But if you're creating a really heavy game that lags a lot, then okay, even at 60 frames, per second at the room, you may still need delta timing. If you're only getting 20 frames per second, you're going to need that delta timing. Otherwise, people are going to have a really bad experience with your game. So I'm not discounting delta time entirely. I'm just saying that generally my approach would be to try to optimize my game and get a more consistent frame rate than to worry about delta timing. There's a lot of people that are going to disagree with that, though.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that since we're talking about 2D games, and ideally most of your games should run at 60 frames per second stable if you're doing a 2D game.
Well, and some people, they
Um,
want to hit that magical 120 frames per second, in which case you're probably going to need some sort of frame skipping or delta
um,
time or something. Because, I mean, look, I have a GTX 3080 in this computer, and, despite supposedly being a 4K ray tracing, I'm like, I don't think it usually hits 120 frames per second on a lot of games. I mean, at least not with the graphics cranked up to max. Sure, if I'm playing Ultimate Doom, it'll run it fine, but yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. I don't want to go off on that tangent. That's kind of I mean, it's timing related, which I think it's important to bring it up, but it's not quite in the same
well,
ballpark.
and to circle back on topic a little and to reach an end here,
Bring us back.
what I really think is important about timing and what is a little overlooked, I said it like 2 times already. Um, the issue with timing isn't how you implement your system, it's how you think about your system. Because what you said is, well, there's a difference between wanting your character to reach a specific position and wanting to walk your character for 1 second.
Oh yeah, I definitely
Because
get a
the
different time.
second in computers is going to be less absolute than a position.
Yes, and
This is just how it's kind of hard to understand because we think like a second is going to happen after a second. That doesn't make any sense. But
sure.
it's just embrace that and
Well, it's like things
think a little
starting at
more.
zero. Sometimes you just have to take it for granted. You just
Uh,
have to be like, look, that's the way it works. And
yeah, and
so I did want to put this in here real quick. So I made a shmup called Braxian for a game jam, and I was playing it the other day, and it is pretty sweet still. I mean, it's not great, but it's still kind of cool in a lot of ways. But the funny part is you want to know how I handled the timing in that one? So as you know, I am a prophet of lazy coding. So the way it would work is it worked with an array, and the array would basically lay out the row in columns, right? But it you could also put in a wait. So what it would essentially say is like, hey, spawn these enemies in this pattern, and then wait for some odd amount of time, and then do the next pattern. And so it's like it's the most unmanageable and ugly way to write anything. So yeah, we all make interesting timing choices sometimes, but
Mm. Well,
but the key word there, and you'll notice, despite how crappy my system was, I still put in an organic weight in there because sometimes you don't know. It's you know what? I don't even want to say you don't know. Who wants to calculate this crap? Who wants to spend the brain power trying to figure out just how many frames is between X and Y? Let the computer do that for you. I showed that at the switch statement earlier on. We can just set our timer and say, "Hey, in 60 seconds, run the next event." If you do it that way, it's nice in general, but you're having the computer do the math for you, and they're good at that. I'm not. You know, I have a calculator open when I'm doing this stuff. So, yeah, there's my closing thoughts on timing, I suppose.
yeah. Again, my closing thoughts on timing are pretty much think of an event and a timing of as like a game state or an event state rather than a point in time, because that will make things easier and you will end up writing better code.
Oh, yeah, that sounds pretty sweet to me. So,
Mm.
this has been Hyomoto and Julian's podcast. I've been Hyomoto
And again, I've been Julian with all my enthusiasm this time.
with all of his enthusiasm, and we've been talking about timing. And I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.